Okay, so last lecture we left off with the influenza, the deadliest, most lethal virus in human history. It's killed more people than anything else in human history. So when we consider where we should place our efforts, our medical biological efforts in viral prevention, probably should be towards influenza because of the mortality rate we see there, the ease of transmission, the all the problems associated with it. So things to keep in mind. So, all right, next one to mention. This is a virus that came out about 10 years ago. It's different variations of it have bounced around. It's called H5N1, or kind of generically the bird flu. And there are different versions, different variations that happen every year. The concerns with this is the potential for mutation. So birds have lots of viruses. Those viruses, if they get into somebody, are pretty deadly. But the reality is most bird viruses don't infect humans, so deadly to us. So our concern with H5N1 and all the subsequent generations or variations of it is if that virus, the bird virus, were to combine with the normal flu virus, the influenza, that usually isn't that deadly, but it spreads easily. Now you have this new, very virulent strain, very deadly strain that transmits very easily. The concern with this one is if there's an intermediate host, in this case pigs, our flu virus gets into a pig, the bird virus gets into the pig, the two different viral strains hybridize, basically blend together. Now we got a big problem. People are in close contact to birds and pigs all the time. Think about people who work in the pork industry or people who work in the chicken, poultry industry. There's a lot of contact with people and these animals. So it's easy to possibly see this transmission. So the World Health Organization is always watching this and trying to predict and head this stuff off and try to prevent global pandemics. Obviously, we're living in one right now. We got some problems. So here's what was said years ago about a potential H5N1 pandemic. If this happens, now this is H5N1, if this pandemic were to start, day one, there's about 2.3 million doses of antiviral meds available for the H5N1 pandemic if it were to start. It would take roughly 100 days, that's 3 months, to produce more doses. The key is if it's the same virus. Now, when antiviral meds are produced, they're based on what we think is the offense of the virus, the offense strategy, the little protein receptors. We're guessing. Hopefully, they guess and predict right. And most of the time, they do a very good job with this. But if the virus were to mutate, now we got a problem. If the virus mutated and our antiviral meds were not effective, it would take roughly 250 days for a new vaccine and supply to be ready. That's if this virus that we know changes. The coronavirus is brand new. We didn't have any antiviral meds or any foundational knowledge of this virus when it hit. That's why this vaccine development for the coronavirus will take almost a year, if not longer. You don't rush vaccine development. You go as fast as you can, but there are massive safety and health implications to keep in mind. You give somebody a vaccination and it's not effective or not the right one, it's going to be worse. So things to keep in mind about vaccinations. They are good things and necessary if we want to maintain human health for the big picture. So, okay, let's jump into a couple others. Some of these you may be familiar with, others may be brand new. Smallpox. Now, I do not want you guys to worry about all these little details. I'm not going to test you over that. I'm going to test you over, do you recognize smallpox as a viral disease? But smallpox, we think, is gone. It was transmitted through the air. You thought you had the flu. Pretty high mortality rate. Back in the 80s, early 80s, it was believed to be eradicated worldwide. Sources were kept in the United States and in Russia for research purposes. The hope is it never comes back out. It never reappears, is what we hope. So, measles are another one. We think, hey, we got it knocked out. So those rash, that characteristic rash all over the body, fever, flu-like symptoms, it's caused by the measles virus. What we saw was a vaccination in the 60s. Cases dropped, but then cases started going back up. We see about 1 million kids in the world die every year of measles. Some people don't vaccinate. Measles also is mutating and becoming resistant to antiviral meds. So it's not gone. It's been knocked back pretty significantly, but still something out there. And we're unfortunately seeing measles cases in the US when we shouldn't. Polio is another viral disease. This young child here shows the signs of having a polio infection when he was younger. It impacts or goes after the neural system. So remember we talked earlier about tissue-specific viruses. They have this specific group of tissues they go after. Well, polio goes after your neural system. It was believed the wild strain was eradicated back in early 2000s. A lot of this credit goes back to President Roosevelt for declaring a war on polio. It has been around since Egyptian times. We have evidence of Egyptians who had polio. The central nervous system becomes paralyzed, which eventually can lead to death. So the brain and spinal cord can kill people from a polio virus. Jonas Salk, a name I'm not going to ask you to remember for this course, but you'll need to know him for micro. Jonas Salk developed the first polio vaccine. Mm-hmm. So we do have vaccines for most of these, many of these viral diseases. The challenge is getting everybody on board, because if some people are not taking them, the virus then is allowed to continue to propagate within the population, and it will continue to change and adapt and evolve and mutate and so on and so forth. So, okay, the next group of viruses are ones that are probably, you're going to have a greater chance of probably picking up one of these than some of the other ones that we just talked about, minus the influenza. Everybody's going to probably get influenza this year or next year or the following year at some point. So, but these, please be careful here. STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. So what I did is I looked at Illinois. And if you go to the Illinois Department of Public Health, you can pull up a map and you can look at statistics on STDs. We talked about gonorrhea and chlamydia and the bacterial STDs. Now we want to think about viral STDs. If you don't understand which one is caused by bacteria versus viruses, you can't treat them appropriately. So, first one to mention, hepatitis. Now, hepatitis has a variety of strains. There are strains A, B, C, D, and G. This is known as a silent virus. Hepatitis will often attack liver and lead to cirrhosis of the liver, long-term, liver failure, potential death. So General symptoms: fever, fatigue, nausea, abdominal pain. I just feel bad. And if you notice, most of the viral diseases, similar overlapping symptoms. So we have to be able to identify and present, here's the symptoms, but here's a potential infection that I picked up. Hep C, we see about 150,000 new cases a year. We see thousands of people dying every year from Hep C. If you guys watch TV and catch some of the commercials, there's some promotional push right now to get the baby boomers to pay attention to see, do they have Hep C? Has it been sitting in their body for 40, 50 years? And is their liver being damaged, or has their liver been damaged over their lifetime because of this virus? People working in the food industry, potential for hepatitis outbreaks in different foods where you could possibly become infected with different strains of hepatitis. The most common one through sexually transmitted sexual transmission is Hep C. Okay, herpes, the gift that keeps on giving. It doesn't go away. If you've ever had a cold sore, you have herpes. About 50 million people in the US, so that's roughly 1 out of 6 people in the US have herpes. So if you have shared chapstick or lipstick or kissed 6 different people, statistically, 1 of them has herpes. We see about 1 million cases a year. About 2/3 of the cases are in the 15 to 24-year-old demographic. Challenge with herpes is it can hide. It can go into remission and just hang out. So I want you to think about, which life cycle does herpes use? Which viral life cycle? We talked about 2 of them. Write it down right now. If you don't remember it, pause the lecture, go back a couple lectures, a couple slides to viral life cycles, look it up. But the problem with herpes, it's never going to leave your body. It is with you the rest of your life. All right, so be careful. Same concerns about STDs that are viral based as the bacterial STDs. If you get infected, get to the doctor, figure out what you need to do for treatment, how to manage it, how to prevent others from picking up the infection. So, things to be aware of. Now, a new category of viruses, what we call emerging viruses. These are viruses that either we've never seen in human history, or there's a new variation of an old friend, if we want to call them that. So the virus has mutated, it has evolved, and now it's different than it was in the past. So many of the viral diseases we're struggling with have done this. They've evolved, they've changed, they've mutated. So when we look at emerging viruses, they're challenging because we don't know the viral structure. We don't know the viral genome. We don't know the viral receptor proteins. It's a brand new thing coming at us. So it becomes challenging to figure out how to defend against it. It takes time, and depending on the virus, we may not have time. You may have significant loss of life before you have this virus figured out. So back in the early 90s, a new virus called Hantavirus showed up in the Southwest. So Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, those areas of the US. We saw this increase in Hantavirus cases. And what was interesting is the virus was associated with mice. Mice were the vector to get the virus to people. Close proximity, mice running around your house, mice turds wherever, and the virus was jumping over to people and causing significant health problems back in the early 90s. Turns out the agent, or the trigger for this, was wet springs. The springtime had more rain than normal in the Southwest, so there were more plants. More plants meant more seeds meant more mice meant greater contact to people. So this is why we want to study viruses, as well as looking at the big picture of ecology and figuring out how all these things are connected. So fortunately, we've gotten a better handle on hantavirus. and it's easier to track and have protocols in place to prevent transmission and spread of that virus. Another one that was big in the news a few years back was Ebola. So Ebola, or known as hemorrhagic fever, we see outbreaks of this in Africa. We've had very, very few cases of Ebola ever make it to the US. It was contained, immediately shut down, and did not spread. Unfortunately, the people who were infected passed away from it, but it did not get out of control. So Ebola, that this little structure here, this is the actual Ebola virus. Weird shaped, stringy-like thing that infects the person. And what the virus does is it gets into your cell, it ruptures and just destroys and decimates the cell, leading to that hemorrhagic fever, literally blood coming out of every pore in your body. So the hand you're looking at is because the Ebola virus has just destroyed the underlying tissue and the blood vessels and everything else. So again, what life cycle is Ebola using? I want you guys to go look it up again. If you didn't look up the one for herpes, go look up herpes and Ebola right now. Okay, so you looked it up, now you're back. So think about the life cycle. So the only positive here is that because of its life cycle, Ebola tends to it burns through a population pretty quickly. The challenge is somebody gets infected with Ebola, jumps on an airplane, within 12 to 24 hours, they're across the world and they've carried Ebola with them and could be transmitting. That's a huge concern when we start talking about the potential for global transmission with these deadly viruses. So Ebola is definitely a nasty one that is being contained and hopefully kept contained as much as possible. Okay, so last one to mention before we take a break here. Zika. Zika has been around for about a decade and a half. It's jumped up in popularity in the last about 3 years. It's made its way to Central America, the Caribbean islands, and now it's made its way up to the US. So we do have Zika in the US. It's been brought up here. Some of it at this point is because people who traveled to Zika regions carried it back with them. The challenge with Zika is it spread through the bite of this Aedes mosquito, specific species of mosquito. The mosquito traditionally could not survive winters in the United States because winter would get too cold. The mosquito couldn't survive here. So its natural range did not extend up into the US. Well, climate change is changing all that. Because climate change is occurring, the average temperatures are rising, and winters aren't as bad as they used to be. These mosquitoes are now able to survive. We have active populations of Aedes mosquitoes in the southern United States. So that means they can be carrying the Zika virus in them, infect people in the southern parts of the US. And it's only a matter of time before it continues to spread up to the Midwest, and who knows how far north it'll go. Depends on climate change. Symptoms: fever, rash, headache, transmission, generally through mosquito bites, but we also see transmission from mother to fetus, and that is the big concern. If a woman is pregnant and infected with Zika, that virus infects the child and it leads to this thing called microcephaly. This child here with the small head, that is due to Zika, a Zika infection in mom while she was pregnant. We don't know if it's possible to transmit Zika through sexual contact. It's still an unknown. But there is no treatment for it. There's no cure at this time for Zika. So if somebody becomes infected, they just have to ride out the viral infection. If somebody's pregnant, as I mentioned earlier, and gets infected, there's not much that can be done. The hope is the virus won't impact this developing fetus, but in many cases, the developing fetus is significantly impacted. and it leads to a lifetime of problems and challenges for that child and family. So, all right, so we'll take a break and then come back and talk about some things known as viroids and prions.